65 million years ago, this animal became extinct on the Severn Estuary. They were dinosaurs. And in those days, the Severn Estuary was a real valley with a narrow, small stream and mud flats, and loads of predators like dinosaurs would be taken off, zebras and all kinds of things like that. So 65 million years ago, I grew up after this. I grew up on the Gower, overlooking the Severn Estuary. When I was 5, my late great Uncle Jack took me fishing for the first time. So this is where the story kind of goes left field. Unbeknown to me, he bought 2 sea trout the night before in Swansea Market. Unbeknown to me, he bought 2 sea trout in Swansea Market. So I thought I caught 2 fish. So he stitched me up. He was a character from Corris. And so I'd never tasted sea trout before. Because I thought I caught it, I became a born again fisherman. So I went 5 or 6 times a week to a little trout stream and immersed myself in nature. So by the time I was 7, I'd gone feral. There's a joke now.
Okay.
George Monbiot feral. But that's true. That's why he wrote that. I'd become one with nature. So that informed everything the rest of my life. That little trick he did, which is an incredible act of kindness. The point being is that all children need to have those experiences, because otherwise they're going to be totally distant from nature. So when I was doing my first degree, which was in geography, but I specialised in ecology and post-glacial geomorphology, so we looked at climate change over 10,000 years, and we looked at the different factors that may have altered the climate. Natural factors, so we kind of written out 8 or 10 or whatever it was, and then at the end, the fairly eccentric lecturers just said quietly, maybe we've altered it. So we said, how do you mean we've altered it? He's just said CO2. We all laughed. It was a long time ago. I then, in my first job in Oxford Nature Reserve in Gower, where I'm from, I read a lot of books, and I realised fairly quickly that British government and all world governments knew about climate change in the 50s. They just decided they wanted economic growth, which you can understand. So it became, while I was doing that job, I did a master's degree externally. I was the main part of the nature reserve at Oxfordshire Sand Dunes. So I went into Swansea University, and the guy said, do you know anything about beetles? I said, no. He said, you soon will. So I did my master's in beetles. So every day I used to go down on my Honda 50 Sports with a haversack full of honey jars and put them out on and caught the beetles to create as a transect. Now this is really central to rewilding. Rewilding to me, and it'll mean different things to different people, is about maintaining the succession of different ecotypes within an ecosystem. So at the front of the dunes, it has totally different sand dunes to where the marram is. And then at the back of the sand dunes, before it becomes woodland, which is the natural succession and the natural vegetation of Britain, oak woodland mostly, apart from mountain tops. In the damp areas in the sand dunes, they're called slats. I discovered by the species I caught that some of the species probably had a home range of about 2 feet. They're that specialist. So if that ecotype or kind of sand dune isn't there, they don't exist. At the back of the sand dunes, there was a marsh. And there was a maths lecturer from Swansea University who, in his spare time, rang the birds to find out where they come from. He discovered that the reed warbler came back to the same nest within a metre after coming back from Africa. So that told me at that time, long before rewilding is even mentioned, that if those little variations in the natural vegetation didn't exist, they don't exist. So that told me it's really important to let natural succession happen, because that each bed is going to contain whatever it is. Now, at the time, conservation, nature conservation, was very old-fashioned. It started in its modern format in the late 40s. And the idea was to have a management plan of an agreed thing based on years of data, usually managing for a certain species or a number of species. So the nature reserve would be sprayed, cut, burned, whatever it was to maintain those species. So it was almost like gardening in a way. Rewilding is the total opposite of that. It isn't about the rare species, it's about having a community that shows. Now, the other thing, definitions, people get very hung up on what rewilding actually means. To some people, rewilding means allowing the woodland to develop itself. To other people, it's planted the woodland. Let me just show you this example where they planted 1 million trees in Scotland. They bought about 4,000 acres of mountain and they replanted the valley and the whole mountain. And over 25 years, it's transformed it because the leaves create then a leaf mold, which then create the woodland flowers. One of the things about rewilding, it isn't something that generally gets quick results, whereas nature conservation might. Let's see where this is. 27. So you can see that's the valley where they replant. That's the woodland after 25 years. And that's called Allerdale. So rewilding, it's a bit like, you can almost compare it to a supermarket, that everything's prescribed that you buy with the old nature conservation, whereas rewilding is a bit more like a organic corner shop where you're never sure what you're going to get, because it's allowed to let the vegetation decide, because it isn't the rare, most of the wildlife we never see, the really important things, the insects, we won't even know what they're there. But that's an integral part of the ecology. If you don't let that succession, the natural succession, because you've got to remember when on that course I learned that 12,000 years ago the glaciers receded and the ice age ended, that's when the natural vegetation of Britain happened. It was all open birch, apart from a few mountaintops. So you had a natural, but of course then people colonized, they came back, they burnt large areas, and it's the only way they could have created open areas, because at those times, there was still been a few bears, and there was certainly been wolves, so they'd been dangerous. So they wouldn't want to clear it as much as, partly because 6,000 years ago they learned about pastoral agriculture, which we talked about earlier in the third. So we modified the whole landscape of Britain, as happened all over the world. One of the key components to change, and Aboriginal people all over the world know this, is fire, because you can modify something really quickly. So all the savannas in East Africa, the savannas in Brazil, were created by people. Now, there would have been natural fires before it, but the scale of what people did, even small densities of people, would have been huge. And that's where you begin to get a very unrewilded landscape. What we've got now, you know, when our friends come from America, the first thing they say when we come to Wales, what a beautifully green country. I just say ICI. is chemicals. We have got high rainfall that emphasises that, but it's art because it's to maintain grass for sheep and agriculture and cattle. Now, I'm not knocking that per se, but that's the reality. And I think it's really important when we look at these things, rewilding projects, that you look at the context and why we're incredibly successful at agriculture, because we've got a huge population. And what changed agriculture in the 50s, 40s, 50s was supermarkets. So immediately there was one place you could go and get everything. So they had deals with all the big agricultural companies, which involved chemicals, which had a massive effect on butterfly and bee populations. So it's going to mean different things to different people. And what we try to do with this book is have lots of different opinions on what occurred, in what the approach was. It's almost invariably, if you think I'm passionate, you ought to meet some of these people, and we've got 52 different projects that mostly have been started by one or two people. In very diverse, sometimes it can be the size of this room, sometimes it can be 50,000 acres, or in the case of Cairngorms National Park, the size of Luxembourg. So we wanted a lot, and they were very haphazard how I found the people for this. The only clue I'll give you, I'm possibly the second best person in Britain at networking after Judy Murray, Andy Murray's mum. So when I get an opportunity, it's like bang. And people love it, because the one thing none of us get seen, heard. As soon as you said to these people, we're doing this book on, oh, great. Everyone was great, apart from the first one I'm going to talk about, which is the one everyone knows. I had a major falling out with, I've forgotten the name, but the one who started with her husband, Neb. Now, what's really exciting, you read the book and it's very inspiring. The reality of what happened, they discovered by complete chance that there was a butterfly that's incredibly rare called the Purple Empress. And they discovered that when they introduced pigs, traditional pigs and longhorn cattle, that the pigs spread willow all over the place because they root. I'll just show you a picture of this just to remind of the process. It's not only about increasing diversity through natural succession, it's about allowing natural processes to happen. And in a way, we're part of nature. So a natural process for us with pigs is to root around. So you're re-establishing that by putting the relatively large fauna back. So let's take a minute to find it. One, three, Isabella tree. So this is one of the Tamworth, which is the closest thing domestically to a wild boar, which would have been common after that. And the remarkable thing about that photograph, you look at its snout, it's covered in wet mud. So it's been snouting. What it does, when willow is snapped as a root, it will re-root. So they created rows of willows. What then happened shocked them. They don't tell you this part of the story. It's in criticism. It's quite common that often we know zip about nature. How much I learned stats doing this project, and it made me realize I knew nothing. Is that things happen, and it's almost always a happy accident. Whether it's the accident you want, or whether it's what comes, one of the rarest butterflies in Britain, they thought the food plant was oak, the purple emperor. It's willow. The day I was there, I spent a week there, the day before I went there, they did a transect, and there'd been small numbers of purple emperor at this site. They did a transect and they counted 360 purple emperors, which is the most purple emperors at any site ever in Europe from just 15 years of doing this project. I had one of the most exciting experiences in the natural world with purple emperors while I was there. They made it, because we had a falling out, and that's life, no complaints. I became very determined to get pictures that no one had got of purple emperors. So I was presented with two experts, one of whom I didn't really take to very much. The other guy, and I wasn't desperate, but I just looked at him, I said, have you ever seen The Clash? Do you like The Clash? He said, David, I saw them live 26 times. So we then watched a male trying to mate with a female 60 feet up, because you don't see them often, they're right up in the trees. And he said, she didn't want to know. And the reason she didn't want to know, she hadn't released the chemical that allows the sperm to get to the eggs. So the female controls the whole dynamic of that population, which is often the case with the natural world, just like real life. So, and we were watching this for 45 minutes. And he said, what she'll do, she'll fold her wings and just drop to the ground. 5 minutes later, that's what she did. So when she dropped, he ran. He got to where she was. It was 8 o'clock at night. It was about 80 degrees, incredibly hot. Found her, and I got there a couple of seconds later. About 5 minutes later, he put his finger out. It was a female, went on the finger, I said on the rose bush, evening light, I got 2,000 photographs. When she saw to wind them up, the next day I just showed the back of the camera to this woman I didn't like, not and we're talking about, and she went green. But no one had done it before because of this guy. And I found out the next day when I showed an old guy where the purple emperor was. This guy got the British Empire Medal for his services to conservation. It was diamond. And when I spoke to her and rang her up to say thanks ever so much for all the help and cooperation, even though they gave me zip, she shouted down the phone, "You were so lucky." I didn't say a word. Life. Just get in. So that was one example how unknowingly, but the key thing, they brought in large domestic animals that reconfigured the natural succession, basically. And it's very simple, these things. Understanding nature is not simple, but often the management, and you've just got to have a long time period. And this came, and they had so many the day before, purple emperors, because the temperature was incredibly hot. They probably had a good year the year before with lots of eggs. And that's how the natural world is. That's how things become extinct when it doesn't go that way. And now we could, because much of farming subsidized, could have, say, a third of the British landscape like that. And there are people who say that. Obviously then, and we focused in the book, there are a lot of people, farmers, particularly say in Wales, and we had the amazing guy who, Nick, who's the head of policy at the Farmers Union of Wales, Nick Fenney, who sees rewilding projects in Wales as another form of English colonialism. So he wrote a brilliant piece, which some people saw, well, why is this in there? Because it's another point of view. the project from the sea to the summit that he was talking about, he was incredibly critical of. When I spoke to the woman, that they've been kicked out now, because look, people didn't want it. When I spoke to her, she actually said to me, the farmers haven't got a choice. Well, I thought, you're not going to last long, Beth. Well, she didn't. And so she's brought her in English imperialist ideas in terms of conservation to a country she doesn't even speak the language or understand people. So now it's much more community-based. Now, the key thing with rewilding projects is to involve local people. Because when you involve local people, you learn. You've got a whole history. Nick wrote really eloquently in his piece about his farm near Fenney, how they knew all the names of the field. In Welsh, they had their own names. So you bring in a lot of stuff. You can just ride roughshod over. And unfortunately, quite a few, often the projects done from people without outside an area who like the idea. They're all well-intentioned, but they don't look in depth enough at the history and particularly the community. For any rewilding project to succeed, it's got to involve the community. It's really nice this morning. I went for a little walk. I discovered a little community orchard. There are nine trees. It doesn't matter. It's there. It's a lovely green space in this really interesting community in Corris. So that was one. I'm going to say a very different, something I've been very involved in, if I could just talk about another. Project. It's about when I was, so I had 2 years in Gower, and I became the warden for the Northumberland coast. So I went somewhere I'd never been before, had no idea of what. So I'm trying to find. Yeah. Try and find little terms. So I went to the Northumberland coast and we had, here we go. We had a little tern colony. And this is a little tern. Now, the reason they're significant, though rewilding is really, and it's a worldwide thing, it isn't just in Britain, it's all over Europe, all over the world, this project. Far more, although rewilding has a positive effect in most cases for climate change, because it increases the tree cover and the natural vegetation. The most significant thing about little terns is that one of the best indicators of climate change. They weigh the same as a packet of crisps. They migrate every August back to West Africa. Because they're really light, they nest on the beach. So that's one reason they're indicators of climate change, because sea level's going up. Only about 1,500 pairs throughout Britain, often in small colonies. So you can imagine that as the British coast became a mecca for tourists, they didn't do too well because they don't like disturbance. But the most significant thing about climate change now, and it might mean their days are numbered, are that because they're really light, they can only dive in the top foot. They feed on almost exclusively, but not totally, but mostly on sand eels. Sand eels are a really good indication of temperature. So as the sea gets warmer, the sand eels go deeper to go for cold water, because that's what they like. Little terns haven't got any food. So you can see how closely, that's a little tern, mother with a newly hatched chick. She's also got another youngster that she's brooding, still in the egg. So there I was I'd never seen these birds before, little terns. So we had a scheme that we fenced off the beach, and we had a warden who lived out on the beach all summer, and we'd give them time off one day a week or whatever it was. So after 2 years, it was the end of we got a grant to do this, and my boss said, there's only one pair left, we're stopping this project next year, David. Well, I'd head down there, I was into the clash. I said, well, I'm resigning then. So, didn't take any notice for that. So I went to Down University, and the top ornithologist in Britain at the time was a professor there, gave me 2 PhD students for the next summer. We had 3 pairs. And the reason I used, and this is equally about rewilding, because it's about colonization by birds, particularly colony nested birds, which little terns are. I said, we're 10 miles from the farmlands. If these birds go, no other bird's going to come colonize back. Because there's no other birds, no reason to do so, because they're colony nesting birds. I said, there's about 10,000 Arctic terns out there. 1 year, they could just turn up, because there's terns here. Well, 6 years later, one night, 2,000 pairs of Arctic terns came. So that's now the biggest nesting tern site on mainland Britain, because we maintain the little terns. So it can be non-intervention, just as in the forest, but it can be very direct intervention. There's no hard and fast rule book. Now, some people think it's a sham, kind of very fashionable sham, because it's not easy to define. It means different things to different people. Now, I see that as a strength. It's just really important that people know that's also seen as it's woolly, it can mean anything. But that's our landscape, different landscapes. And you've been on the course this week. Sorry for those of you online, you wouldn't notice, but there's been a course with people here. It means totally different things to different people. And so therefore, I think it's really important for local communities to devise their own rewilding projects that relate to their landscape, that they know their history of. There's only one colony left in Wales. And to me, they're incredibly, because they're like punt birds in a way, they're birds right on the edge. And they're incredibly, bigger birds come in like kestrels, come and try and take them. Because they're sitting on eggs, they're pretty easy to, but they're real survivors. So they've got everything going against them. But if any of you, I don't know where people are, if everyone's in Wales, the site in North Wales is near Prestatyn, a place called Gronyn, and they have about 4 or 5 wardens who've got viewing facilities, and if you join their club, their tern club, you can look at the terns from a little height nearby. So they've had over 100 volunteers, and what I did to get the community involved at Northumberland, what changed it, I worked with a filmmaker, and we made a film with the little terns, and we had 100 volunteers. So it changed as soon as protection schemes, whether it's golden eagles or little terns or hedgehogs, these are great ways to focus people to actually, because we all care, but the sadness very often, we're either too busy or we don't know how to be effective in that care. These are ready-made projects, and there's nothing like a project to unify people. You get the usual infighting, the top dog, all that shit, but it's actually a really good way for people to demonstrate. And in this one, they're colouring them. And there's a professor at nearby University who's done a lot of work over 20 years or more. They found the oldest little tern in the world, 26-year-old, because he ran it. So you can get loads of information. It takes a long time. There's no quick fixes, but that's another way you can actually get involved and learn.